Hello, good morning, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. I will get started in a few minutes, let people join us. Morning, Stuart. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, the 86th in the series. And you find me this week in my other natural habitat. So this is my other office. This is me actually in my office at work. So welcome to this room. I know you'll be used to being in my office at home, but I am in work for this week's. And for those of you who have not watched any of these, my name is Lorna. The series Learn with Lorna was introduced at the beginning of COVID-19 in order to introduce people to the collections that we look after. We are part of the Highland Archive Service, so we have 4 archive centres. We have the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, Skye and Lochaber Archive Centre in Portree, and Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick. And together the 4 of those make up the Highland Archive Service. If you've been watching before, you'll know exactly what I'm about to say, and you're probably saying it along with me. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But again, if you are able to donate towards our work, then we would be very, very grateful for that. And there's a link to be able to do so, whether you're watching live on Facebook or whether you're watching it subsequently on YouTube. I'm seeing a few people saying it's breaking up, but not everyone. So I hope it's going to come through okay. If not, I'll put a link in to catch up with it on YouTube. So this week we are carrying on with our theme of crime and punishment in a collection that may or may not seem surprising, depending on your knowledge of Scottish history. So we're looking in the church records. Now, I've spoken previously about the church records, but it wasn't since the 16th of July 2020, so well over a year ago. So if you want to know more about the church records that we look after as a whole, then please do go back and watch that previous episode. But this week we're focusing particularly on the stories of crime that can be found within these collections. I know I've said this previously, but I think it can be a little bit hard for us to understand sometimes the influence that the church had on all aspects of daily life in the past. They had control over education, over poor relief, over loads of things. And as we'll see today, they had control over behaviour and moral standards. We hold well over 1,000 volumes of Kirk Session, Presbytery and Synod records. These are the local, the regional and the district level of church courts in the Church of Scotland and those free churches which came back into the Church of Scotland. We hold them at the Highland Archive Centre, where I am now in Inverness, and also in Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William. And most of them are full of breaches of discipline. There's far more of that than there is of anything else in the church records. You may remember I spoke a few weeks ago on the witchcraft session about the Scottish Reformation and the creation of the first and second books of discipline, which were produced in 1560 and 1578. Well, one of the things that these books of discipline did was to propose alterations to the structure of the church. So introducing those church courts that I mentioned, the Kirk Session, the Presbytery, the Synod, and also changed the way that power was allocated, who made decisions on certain things. So for instance, it gave the Kirk Sessions, the local churches, the authority to set standards of behaviour, to monitor them, to fine and punish those who fell short of those standards. Those are the breaches of discipline, and also to push for regular attendance at church. It also established, as I mentioned, the next court up, the Presbytery. They comprised representatives of the Kirk Sessions. The presbyteries had authority to appoint ministers and school teachers, authorise construction and repair to churches and manses, and often became involved in the breaches of discipline that were referred up to them from the Kirk Sessions. The synods, as I mentioned, they've now been abolished in Scotland. That was the next court up, and then at the top of that, the General Assembly. And although they did occasionally have cases referred up the chain to them, the majority of the cases are found in the Kirk Session and Presbytery records. And so that's what we're going to look at today. So what sort of things are we talking about when we talk about breaches of discipline? Well, I mentioned in the Witchcraft Week, I spoke about Elspeth Buie, who was accused of witchcraft for burying a live cockerel under her doorstep with the aim of trying to obtain healing for her child who was suffering from convulsions. She was publicly rebuked and made to ask for forgiveness and then stand in sackcloth. So we've looked at that one already, but what other sorts of things are there? Well, there are references to Sabbath-breaking in lots of the Kirk Sessions. For instance, in Arkitt and Logie Wester Kirk Session minutes of the 24th of December 1733, which talk about various breaches of the Sabbath. So for instance, this one here. Helen and Janet Miller appeared, so I'm going to say appeared all the time. The texts actually say compared, but it means appeared, and I'll say that for the sake of making it easier to understand automatically. So Helen and Janet Miller appeared and confessed that they were flitting on the Lord's Day, so they were moving house. The session, taking this affair to their consideration, and because these lasses were but young, appointed them to get a rebuke before the session and be exhorted to beware of such practice again, with certification that if they be guilty of the like in time to come, they shall be obliged to make public appearance before the congregation, and they were called in to have this intimated to them. So they're moving house, and that's what they've done wrong. In that instance, because they're young and it's their first offence, if you will, they were just called to apologise and be told off by the session, but not in front of the entire congregation. Another extract from that same volume of Arkitt and Logie Wester is the case of Donald McIntosh. He was called, it said he had been cited and called, he appeared and being interrogated, confessed that he had heard that Donald McWilliam and George Arkitt and Anne Cameron, John McAllen and Alexander Reid and another woman were playing at the trump and dancing in his house on the Sabbath night. The trump being like the Jew's harp, so a small instrument played in the mouth. So they're being accused of playing musical instruments and singing and dancing on the Sabbath. It said it was alleged that this had happened after he and his wife had gone to bed. George Arkitt, servant to Donald McIntosh, being cited and called, appeared, and being interrogated, he confessed that a little after supper, he and himself and John McAllen and Donald McWilliam were playing at the trump, but they did not dance, and that John McAllen had started it. The session, considering that the other persons concerned had not appeared, delayed it to the next meeting to discuss again. So you can see there the sort of cases that are being dealt with. And that last case is interesting. It was referred to the next meeting where more of the accused could attend, and they appeared and they told their story, but they said they didn't think they should be punished because it was nearly midnight, so it nearly wasn't the Sabbath. But they were accused and found guilty and were subject to public rebuke. So their telling off and disciplinary response was in front of the entire congregation. Just in that same volume, the next case talks about James Miller and Dougal McGill, and what they were accused of was travelling with a load of herring on the Sabbath. And again, they're kind of mitigating circumstances with it. The weather had prohibited them from travelling any other day, and so they'd had to do it that day. But you can see the sort of things that are being discussed and the sort of things people are being told off for. And now I'm aware I've used all the examples from Arkitt and Logie Wester. They're not particularly being told off in that area. They're common right across the whole of our Kirk Session and Presbytery minutes. And you can wonder there whether maybe those who were playing the trump and dancing might have had a bit too much to drink, possibly. And that is something, again, that we often find in these volumes. So, for instance, this is recorded in the Kirk Session records for Cromarty East Church. And if I remember correctly, Jenny, I think, is this the church in Cromarty you have a connection to? Let me know. So this is the 19th of January, 1761. It says a delation was given against John Davidson, so that's an accusation, he's been accused, given against John Davidson of Drumhall, of his being frequently drunken, and of his having kept company with a woman of bad fame called Catherine Robertson in Margaret Boyne's house. So he's accused of drinking, but he's also accused of keeping company with someone of bad fame. And they are reporting that this woman of bad fame, Catherine Robertson, went with him to go to his own room at an unseasonable hour of the night, and they were heard talking together on the way by the neighbours in a very unseemly manner. The session, thinking this very scandalous behaviour, ordered them to be summoned to attend the next diet, so the next meeting, which is hereby appointed to be on Monday next. The three named persons were summoned to the next session on the 26th of January, 1761, where they were questioned separately. John Davidson being admitted to being drunken of late and of requesting the presence of Catherine Robertson. So he admits that he's drunk and he admits that he has asked for this woman of bad fame to come to him. Margaret Boyne, who owned the house, admitted fetching Catherine Robertson on behalf of John Davidson, and Catherine Robertson admitted conveying John Davidson to his home, but insists she did not enter his room. After consideration of this, the session rebuked each person individually and exhorted them to more regular and Christian-like behaviour. If they did not behave more regularly in time to come, they would be punished to the utmost rigour of the law. And I think that's a really interesting example of just the level of research that they would put into these things. So this story has been given by somebody. They have investigated it. They have called the person accused of being drunk, the woman of bad fame, the woman who owned the house. They've all had to come in and give their testimonies. The session have then gone away and considered what they think happened, and then exhorted them. So they've had a rebuke, they've been told off, and they've been exhorted to better behaviour. And I think that's, again, really quite hard for us to imagine for something, you know, in our day and age where we have so much freedom that the thought of someone saying you can't go to that person's house, or we heard you talking after that time at night, is really hard for us to get, I think. Another example of drunkenness can be found in Kirk Session minutes from April 1769. And this is one of my colleague Peter, this is one of his favourite extracts. Okay, so this says, it was reported to the session that day. So again, that thing of people telling on each other and reporting things. It was reported to the session that day that there was a fearful breach of Sabbath in the parish, and if Providence had not ordered that some had been later in going home that evening than ordinary, it was believed that corpses might have been found at their doors, particularly that of James Fraser, for he and Kenneth Roy, Robert McAllister, Janet McThomas, and Mary Roy, servant to James McInroy, having crossed the ferry of Bewley and returning late that evening towards Drumchardon, went into the house of John Arkitt, shoemaker at Newton, and drank ale and aquavita until they were so intoxicated that many of them had their clothes so dregged with dubs and clay as if they had been drawn through it. So just that image of them being so drunk and basically crawling home, and the neighbours complaining about it. In Aldern Kirk Session in 1716, there are people accused of other things to do with the Sabbath and to do with alcohol and partying. So there are people accused of selling ale during divine worship. I don't know if it's actually in the church or just at the time that divine worship was happening. Not to mention the partying of Agnes Fraser, Barbara Hutchin, and Christian Munro, who are believed to have kept a tryst with soldiers visiting the area. The Free Church also operated under this very similar structure of breaches of discipline. And so 100 years later, you know, we've been looking at the 1700s, but over 100 years later in Ardclagh Free Church minutes, we can read this extract. It was reported that Janet McIntosh, a communicant, was charged with uttering very unguarded language and vilifying and traducing the characters of some of the elders. So she sounds like a bit of a character. So she's unguarded language and basically bad-mouthing the elders of the church. The session unanimously agreed to cite Janet McIntosh to appear before them at the next meeting. And then the note of the next meeting says, Janet McIntosh admitted that she had been guilty of uttering unguarded language, and she professed penitence, and she was removed. Interesting that because it reads to me like because what she had been doing was bad-mouthing the session then deliberated and were of the opinion that her name should at present remain on the roll, but she should be admonished to be more circumspect in the future. And if she should be ever again found guilty of the same conduct, her name should no longer remain on the church roll, which having been done, she was dismissed. And again, I think it can be quite difficult for us to think what a huge deal that would be to be taken off the church roll of communicants. But by far and far and away, and anyone who works in archives will back me up on this, I'm sure, by far the most common breach of discipline are things to do with sexual relations. Sex outside marriage, even if they subsequently intended to get married. So for instance, in Kilmally in the 1890s, this extract appears. Next called was Jessie Harkey, daughter of Robert Harkey, ploughman. The Reverend R.B. Crawford stated that he had not exercised the authority the Kirk Session had conferred upon him as at the last meeting, so he hadn't done what he had been instructed to do, for the reason that he had found Jessie Harkey still continued to be on very intimate terms with Charles Fraser. He understood it was the mind of the session that they should either marry or terminate the intimacy, and doubtful relations existed between them. Jessie Harkey was administered to tell the truth and confessed to the intimacy still being upheld, but was prepared that if Charles Fraser would not marry her, she would have no further relations with him. And you wonder there whether she, had been led to believe that they would be married and that was why it was okay. Who knows? But interesting to see, and that's the 1890s, so that's very much later that the church is still having a say in that. There's lots of references, as I say, to this, to fornication in various forms, and I think probably I have, if not already, I will have the world record for saying fornication in a short space of time, which I never thought I would do before I came into this job. There are, as I say, those references to relations outside marriage, relationships that result in illegitimate births, adultery, abuse, and even incest in these records. And there are breaches related to sex just littered throughout these collections. So let's look at some of these stories and some of the common terminology used. So for instance, in 1719, the records of Calder Kirk Session record the crime of Peter Dallas and Anne Williamson. The first entry reads, Peter Dallas in Meikle Budgate was reported of being guilty of uncleanness with Anne Williamson of Inchnacardick. They were summoned to appear at the next meeting. On appearance, they confessed their guilt and were appointed to be rebuked in front of the entire congregation. And that happened every week for 3 or 4 weeks before they were considered to be absolved from the scandal. So the phrase uncleanness appears a lot, as does the phrase carnal knowledge, so knowing somebody's body better than you should do. And this appears throughout lots of references, lots of cases that appear throughout these records. Sometimes the church saw essentially repeat offenders. So this is Ardclach Kirk Session in 1729. Sorry, it's not, that's entirely wrong. It's Cromdale Kirk Session in August 1703. The accused Anna Grant was called and appeared. And on being interrogated as to if she was with child, she answered that she was with child and that William Fraser, son to John Fraser in Achinaro, with whom she had relapsed into fornication, was the father thereof. So she's admitting that she's expecting an illegitimate child and says that it's William Fraser who is the father of the child and that it's a relapse in fornication. William Fraser appeared and confessed guilt with the said Anna Grant, this being a trelapse to him and a quintuplapse to her. Never come across these words anywhere else. So essentially, she has done this 3 times, done the wrong thing, and he has done it 4 times. So it's a quintuplapse as opposed to a relapse. And so it names all the people that they are both accused of having slept with previously. And it goes on to say that the heinousness of their sin and guilt being held forth into them, they are seriously exhorted to repentance and appointed to attend the presbytery. So that's being passed up from the Kirk session to the presbytery to address, because they are, as I say, almost repeat offenders. But the heinousness of their sin and guilt, they're not messing about with these words. Now, as I mentioned, these breaches of discipline with relation to sexual relations make up the vast majority of the cases of discipline that we see in these records. And they're great for things like illegitimate children, actually, aside from the kind of tragedy of the stories that appear in them. If you're a researcher and you're trying to find information about an illegitimate birth, these can be really useful and interesting. And sometimes those stories about illegitimate births don't appear at the time you might expect. So they don't always appear at the moment that the woman is falling pregnant or that the child was born. So for instance, this example from 1773 is from the parish of Petty. And this didn't come to light until several years later. So quite unusual. So from the minutes of 1773 comes the story of David Dunbar, Island of Petty, and Isabel Fraser, his servant, with whom he has committed adultery. This indiscretion was overlooked for several years until it came to light that a secret child may have been born. And so this is the discussion of the session at that point. The session, therefore, thought it proper to examine the affair. So they've discovered years later that something's happened, and they're going to go back and reassess, try and gather evidence about what happened all that time ago. They called in John Fraser of Balnaclack, who related that he had discovered the pair in bed and had been seized with shame and fear in case they hurt him. A lot of these in the church records, a lot of people telling on other people. There are even some examples of people looking over a fence, thinking that they see people having sex and then going, I'll just go back and double check to make sure that's what I saw. So for this one, they called in John Fraser of Balnaclack, who related that he had discovered the pair in bed and been seized with shame and fear in case they hurt him. He also told the session he had learned that Isabel Fraser had for certain brought forth a child to David Dunbar in the byre, which child was carried to the town of Forres by Catherine McIntosh, a cotter woman, and left in some part of the town, and the said Catherine McIntosh jumped over a dyke and hid herself until the child was taken up. So a story there that there had been this man and his servant had had this child. The child had been born in the byre, so in a cattle shed, and that the child had been taken away, basically left lying, while a local woman hid behind a wall and watched to make sure that someone took the child and it was safe. Really interesting story. So it goes on to record that they carried on investigating the case by finding these supposed witnesses and interviewing them as well. So Catherine McIntosh, who is said to have carried the child away to Forres to make sure it was taken away by somebody, was put on oath to give her side of the story. She denied, under pressure from the session, having any knowledge of a child born to Isabel Fraser. She also stated her own innocence in the matter of having carried the said child to Forres. She said that she knew nothing of any such thing, neither was accessory thereto in any manner or way. As the session could provide no evidence on the case, and the only other witness was in the south of Scotland, This affair is deferred to another occasion. There is no further mention of it. 15 years we look through these Kirk Session records to see if they did come back and discuss it, but there's nothing. And also, neither party, neither David Dunbar nor his servant Isabel Fraser, who were accused of this relationship, neither of them appeared before the Kirk Session. So it's a very interesting case. If you think of all the ones I've touched on so far, there's very much someone's accused, people are accused, they're immediately pulled in front of the session to be interviewed, for the evidence to be gathered. And in this instance, neither of the people accused are called in front of the session. It's only the woman who is accused of having taken the child away that is called. It's really interesting as to why the session was willing to let this go. Possibly, I don't know, but possibly David Dunbar was someone of a little bit of influence, perhaps. I don't know, of course, I don't know the story of what happened between those two, but of course, those stories that many people have in their families of someone and a servant having a relationship and an illegitimate child lead us to wonder how much influence, how much abuse, how much power was involved in those decisions, how much were all parties allowed to have a say in what happened if they were the servant. So there are some that are maybe implied, often not explicitly explained, but there are some cases of abuse and of incest which are detailed within the records. So for instance, this one from Tein, this is from 1792. Tein, 16th of January, 1792. The moderator represented that he laid before the presbytery, so this is again, we've gone from the Kirk Session up to the next level because of the seriousness of the accusation. He laid before the presbytery at their meeting here on the 23rd of November an extract of the minutes of the Kirk Session of 10th of October last relating to Alex Roy in Balkeith. The said Alex being cited to that diet, that meeting, called, appeared, and being interrogated, adhered to the confession he had made before the session of his guilt of incest with Elspeth McIntosh. So the session have investigated it. He's confessed his guilt to the session. They've gone, this is too big for us to handle. This needs to go up to the presbytery. So the presbytery now are seeing Alex Roy, and he has repeated his confession. He was long and seriously dealt with by the presbytery in a way of reproof and exhortation. Afterwards, in testimony of their abhorrence of his heinous iniquity, for warning to others, as well as conviction to himself that he may repent, they appointed the moderator on the Sabbath following to pronounce from the pulpit and before all the congregation the sentence of highest excommunication against the said Alex Roy in the manner directed by the rulers of the church, which was accordingly done, and the unhappy man now lives under that heavy sentence. So he has been excommunicated, he has been taken out of the church. And it's interesting there, the two parts of that. So it's one as a warning to others, and it's secondly in the hope that this will encourage him to repent of his sins. So that was what happened to Alex Roy, who was accused of the incest. What happened to Elspeth McIntosh? Well, to find that out, we move from the church records to the court records, where we find a remission of sentence. So she had a sentence passed on her of transportation and life banishment from Scotland, but that was repealed. Now, the sentence was not because of the incest. Let's see. So, as a result of the relationship, Elspeth had given birth to a son who was subsequently murdered. So, as if she, poor woman, hasn't gone through enough. The child was subsequently murdered. Each claimed the other to be the perpetrator. So Elspeth said that Alex had killed the child. Alex said that Elspeth had killed the child. And incidentally, the relationship between them, Elspeth was Alex's niece of his former wife and also his servant. So again, that servant-master relationship there. So both of them, the child was born, both accused the other person. But it would appear that the authorities believed Alex over Elspeth because Elspeth was transported to Inverness, put into the prison. She was tried and sentenced to be transported beyond the seas to such place as His Majesty shall appoint during all the days of her life. So she was to be sent away from Scotland and never to return. And the Inverness Tolbooth warding book shows that Elspeth remained in custody in Inverness jail, awaiting transportation for 9 years until 1799. And what it says then is that favourable circumstances have since been humbly represented, and therefore His Majesty did remit, pardon, and freely forgive and discharge the said Elspeth McIntosh of the crime of child murder and all the aforesaid sentences. We have no idea what the favourable circumstances are. Did Alex die and confess that it had been him? Did someone come forward and say that they'd seen something? Or did we find that the child had never been murdered at all? We don't know. But it's a great example of how you can use different types of records to find out more about a story. And I'm seeing you there, Jen, saying Jenny sent the last one sounds like the script for a movie, as does that one. There are also some less common breaches of discipline to be found within these records, and that's what I'm going to finish off with. So, for instance, this extract from Dorr's Kirk Session, 1828, the story of Christian Calder, and Hugh Fraser. I came across this looking through the Dorr's Kirk Session minutes for something else the other day, and my colleague Anne, who some of you may know, the family historian, has a long-standing connection to that area, Dorr's, and so I ran through to Anne and said, I've just found this story in the Dorr's Kirk Session. Isn't it amazing? And she said, yeah, that's my great-great-grandfather. So I'm now here to tell you the story of Anne's great-great-grandfather. So it reads, the Dorr's Kirk Session. So appeared Christian Calder or Baron, wife of William Baron, tenant of Balfroig. So she is appearing before the session and she's complaining that Hugh Fraser, tenant of Balmore, was guilty of defaming her and her family, particularly that the said Hugh Fraser, one evening lately on his way home from Inverness, addressing himself to her, the said Christian Calder or Baron, said in the hearing of credible witnesses that her father, John Calder, when in the army, had been found guilty of disinterring a dead body, and she therefore craved that the session would cause the said Hugh Fraser to make public confession in church in the presence of the congregation on 3 separate Sabbath days that the above allegation was false. So Hugh Fraser has accused Christian's father at some point in the past when he was in the army of disinterring and digging up a dead body. So he's just approached her late at night and accused her father of this. And she is saying there's absolutely no way that is true, and I want you to apologise. I want you to apologise publicly in front of the entire congregation and make it very clear that that wasn't true. So almost like when you see in the newspapers now, publishing an official apology. The session, considering the said complaint and understanding that the said Hugh Fraser is in attendance, ordered him to be called, and he, having appeared and the above being read and explained in his hearing, whereupon being exhorted to tell the truth and interrogated, he confessed that in a fit of irritation he might, on the occasion alluded to, have alleged some such thing of the said John Calder, but whether the allegation was true or false, he was now extremely sorry that the words had somehow escaped him and given such offence and seemed to have hurt the feelings of his neighbour and connection. Parties being removed and the session taking the whole of this case to their serious consideration, and considering especially the candid confession and sorrow of Hugh Fraser, conceive it would be both inexpedient and unwarrantable to proceed against him as craved by the complainer. So basically he said, no, it's not true, but I was really annoyed, and so I just said it, and I'm really sorry. But it's that wording of he might have said something, perhaps something similar to that, maybe. And the the reference to the words escaping him, like it was somehow out with his control that it was said by him. And he's very sorry if it's given offence. I think it would be quite reasonable to take offence at someone accusing your father of grave robbing. But the thing that sparked Anne's interest was the fact that it said there he was sorry if he'd offended his neighbour and connection. And when she had a look, she found that she was his sister-in-law. So there's perhaps a bit of a story between the two of them already. Finally, I wanted to read one last thing to you, which was put together by my colleagues in Nucleus, my colleague Anne, another Anne in Nucleus, a story of a minister having a bit of a hard time. The Reverend Alexander Pope of Ray, and I'm going to read to you exactly as Anne has typed up the notes. Caithness has seen its fair share of feisty characters over the centuries, and one such character was the Reverend Alexander Pope, who was ordained in September 1743 as the minister of the parish of Ray, which was described at the time as being in deplorable condition, and the parishioners flagrantly vicious. What a great phrase, flagrantly vicious. A challenge indeed for any new minister. But Alexander was a formidable man with strong devout principles, who often went to some inventive lengths to get his message across. The ministry was often delated constabulary authority, and as such, Reverend Pope arrived in Ray carrying a short, stout cudgel, which he referred to as the bailey. So he's been given constabulary authority, so he is in a position of authority in the community, and he's carrying this cudgel, this big stick around with him. On hearing about a crofter who lived with his mistress and 2 children, Reverend Pope paid the farmer a visit to insist he appeared before the Kirk Session to renounce his actions in a public way. Before I submit to any such thing, you may pluck out my last tooth, said the farmer. So, no, I will not be coming to apologise for my actions. The following Sunday, on noting the absence of the farmer, Reverend Pope dispatched 3 of his strongest elders to ensure the farmer's capitulation. Reverend Pope had carefully chosen his church elders to be strong of body as well as belief. By the means of a rope, they succeeded in binding the farmer and marching him into the church, where they tied him to the front pew until the sermon drew to a close, with the Reverend Pope saying, "You told us we might pull the last tooth out of your head before you would submit to be where you are, but poor braggart, where are you now?" One Sunday evening, the Reverend was sitting outside the manse and observed that there was a bigger attendance in the nearby tavern than there ever had been in church that day. Amongst its clientele, he saw many of the parishioners whose little measure of sense and reflection was overpowered by the fumes of liquor in which they had indulged. So basically, you can see a lot of people and they all look quite drunk. As he debated what best to do, 2 fellows came up to ask him to join in their revelry. While he appreciated their hospitality, he declined the offer and commented how upset he was at them drinking on the Sabbath, and said that they should just go home. This did not go down well, and he refused a second offer to drink with them, and the men turned towards the tavern to gather up their associates. The next moment, nearly a dozen men rapidly approached Reverend Pope, not so drunk that they couldn't fight, and not sober enough to refrain from doing so. Reverend Pope rose from his seat and stood with his back to the wall, his hand tightly gripping his cudgel, the bailey, behind him. The gang leader held a bottle and a glass, which he deliberately filled and held out to Mr. Pope, once again trying to get him to drink, which just sounds incredibly threatening, I think. Once again, Mr. Pope refused and remonstrated with them for drinking on the Sabbath, and this was the signal for battle. As the leader threw the bottle at Mr. Pope, he was met with a stunner of a blow on the head with the bailey for his efforts. So Mr. Pope drew that cudgel out from behind his back and hit the man over the head. Only after another 3 or 4 had rushed forward and met with the same fate did the rest of the gang beat a retreat, carrying their wounded companions away from the minister. A somewhat lively introduction to a new parish. So you can see there that there are all sorts of stories within the Kirk Session records. And as I say, very, very few of them relate to church life in terms as we would understand it now. Very few references to sermons, to anything like that. Lots of stories, some of them very sad, some of them slightly amusing. Anyway, I will stop talking because I've run over by 10 minutes, so I do apologise. I'm sorry for those who are saying the connection is not quite as clear here as it is at home. I will be returning to home next week. This is a one-off, me being in my work office. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've been able to hear along and follow most of it. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we would be very grateful for that. And I hope you can join me next week when I'll be looking at further tales from the court records. So I'm already looking forward to that one. Thank you.